quiet morning at the US Embassy in the capital of Iran. Moments later, the calm is shattered. Outside the gates, a sea of protesters swarm, their voices rising in angry chants, their fists shaking in the air. People flood over the compound walls. By the end of the day, over 50 personnel have been taken hostage. Blindfolded and bound, they're paraded in front of cameras as a stunned world watches. The Iran hostage crisis has begun, a 444-day ordeal. Many say that the US handled the crisis poorly through multiple points, and so from this, I have devised a complete 5-step guide for you to follow when it comes to needing to badly handle a hostage crisis as a political figure, just in case you need to. Now, the crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It started decades earlier with the US's interference in Iran. To start, in 1953, the CIA helped overthrow Iran's elected prime minister after attempting to take control of Iran's oil industry back from the big powers. The US replaced him with the Shah, who was loyal to the Western countries and pretty hated by the general population. By 1979, Iranians had enough, and a revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini forced the Shah out of power. Khomeini's new government was highly critical of the US, especially after the US allowed the Shah to come to America for medical treatment. Khomeini later referred to the US as the Great Satan, and the embassy became somewhat of a target for the country's anger. The first step is always to foster hatred that could motivate a lot of people to take severe actions in protest of your country's decisions that impacted them. Despite the growing signs of trouble, the US Embassy in Tehran didn't have nearly enough security. On November 4th, hundreds of protesters climbed the walls and took over the building. There were just too many attackers, and by the end of the day, 66 people had been taken hostage. The US government just really wasn't ready to handle this crisis. They didn't have a solid plan in place. The international reaction to the crisis was more of a mixture of condemnation, concern, and diplomatic maneuvering. Many nations condemned Iran's actions as a blatant violation of the diplomatic norms under Vienna Convention, which protects embassies and their diplomatic staff. The US was deeply caught off guard by the attack, which didn't help the swiftness of their response. A surefire way to transform a bad-looking hostage situation into a proper crisis is by botching an extraction attempt. In April 1980, the US tried a bold mission to rescue the hostages named Operation Eagle Claw. The plan involved helicopters and special forces landing in the Iranian desert to sneak into Tehran, but things went wrong from the start. Early on, a sandstorm damaged some of the helicopters, leaving the mission too short on working helicopters. As the team decided to cancel the mission, tragedy struck as one of the helicopters crashed into a transport plane, causing a horrendous explosion that killed 8 US servicemen. With the rescue attempt pretty much in complete ruins, the US had to leave behind equipment and the wreckages in the desert. The mission's failure was a significant blow to US morale, both at home and abroad, fueling the frustration and skepticism about the Carter administration's ability to manage the crisis effectively. Who crushed Mr. Carter's helicopters? We did? The sands did. They were God's agents. Wind is God's agent. These sands are agents of God. They can try again. After the failed rescue attempt, the US ran out of good options, really. The hostages were held in terrible conditions, often beaten or kept in isolation. Back in the US, people were frustrated and angry. President Carter's inability to solve the crisis hurt his popularity and became a pretty large issue in the 1980 presidential election. The hostage crisis continued to dominate American politics and media coverage throughout 1980. As a result, the crisis became a central issue in the presidential campaign. Finally, the hostages were released after long negotiations, with Algeria acting as a mediator. The final agreement, known as the Algiers Accords, was signed on January 19, 1981. These negotiations were promoted by Iran's demands, which included the return of the Shah's wealth, unfreezing Iranian assets in the US, cancellation of US legal claims against Iran, and a pledge of non-interference in Iran's internal affairs. The US agreed to these terms, including unfreezing $7.9 billion in Iranian assets and creating an international tribunal to handle the financial disputes. Despite Carter's efforts to resolve the crisis before leaving office, the hostages were released just minutes after Reagan was inaugurated as president on January 20th, 1981. While the hostages returned safely, the crisis left a lasting mark on US-Iran relations. The old US Embassy in Tehran is now a museum coined the Den of Espionage, showcasing what the Iranian government says are examples of American meddling in their country. There is no US Embassy in Iran anymore. All you get is a website. Okay, so the lesson for future leaders is clear, right? Just follow these proven steps and you too can navigate a crisis with unbelievable finesse. You've successfully executed what you set out to do.